The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. I hope you're doing well this week. I am. And as you can see, I am joined this week by Kate Gale, and she is someone who has a cult story to share with us and also a recovery story to share with us. Now, just to intro her a little bit here, she is the co-founder and managing editor of Red Hen Press and editor of the Los Angeles Review. And she teaches in the low residency MFA program at the University of Nebraska in poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. And this was actually something I was very interested in talking about, is writing and that sort of thing. So welcome to my show, Ms. Gale.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So I guess first off, we should start with with who you are and how you came to talk to me today. What's you were involved or grew up in? You're a second gen member of a destructive cult out of the Northeast. Can we talk about that first?
Yeah, so I think the 60s were a good time for cults in America. Although America itself is a good country for cults for whatever reason. I think that when you look at different countries around the world, America does seem to be quite a little hotbed for them. But the 60s were a very good time for starting cults. And a lot of the cults of the 60s didn't last. But the one that I grew up in is still around, although it has now moved to Canada. And obviously, some of the cults of the 60s were really involved with more drugs and sex. And the one that I grew up in was a right-wing religious cult. And the cult leader, whose name was George Eversfield, had a mission, and that was to quote, save people for God. But I'll be very curious, Chris, to hear what your quote cult definitions are. I like Amanda Montell in the book Cultish, her sort of definitions, I think, that she worked with there, which are that there, first of all, has to be a cult leader for it to really be a cult. It can't just be a group of people living together. There has to be a cult leader. That person has to control the people in the cult, their behavior, usually also taking their money and controlling their sex lives and controlling their children. And that was true of the organization where I grew up in. And I think, that's true to a great extent in Scientology. But afterwards, people would sometimes say to me, well, there's certain ways in which the Catholic Church or the Mormon Church is a cult. The other thing about a cult that I haven't mentioned yet is there really is no exit strategy. And for most cults, there really is no exit strategy. But when you talk about the Catholic Church or the Mormon Church, we all know people who have left. And in fact, are sometimes still friends with people that are in the Catholic Church or the Mormon Church, particularly the Catholic Church. So to say that there is no exit strategy would really be untrue. Whereas a real cult, there really isn't an exit strategy. So, people did, quote, leave the farm, but if you left, then you were dead, you were going to hell, and you're never allowed to speak to anybody again. So that kind of an exit strategy in which there really isn't one, that makes it a cult. So when my mother decided to join, she was 22, I think. She had two very small children. I was one of them. So we were just kind of ushered in. But that was the deal. You gave your children to the cult leader along with your life, your money, and that was it. You were going to just do his bidding for the rest of your time on the planet.
Right.
And so that was what she had made that decision. I obviously, was growing up there, and at 18 decided that I was deciding to leave, and actually made a couple of attempts before then to quote run away. But at some point, someone told me that if I really ran away and got too far, that the police would take me back. Wasn't really clear about police. I'd never met any police people. Um, and like I'd never seen a police station or any police, like there was no radio there, there was no television, there were no movies. So I had no real sense of the police. But it was clear to me that there could be adult authority figures outside that would just take me back, that I wouldn't get far. And so I decided at some point I'm going to have to hang here until I'm 18. It became clear to me that that was some age where I would be an adult, and so at 18 I ended up leaving. Um,
If I
but
might, if I
yeah,
might walk back just a couple steps, because I just have some questions about the experience and what this was about. Did this group have a formalized name?
yeah. So it was called Highview Church Farm, but the business they owned was called the Jolly Farmer and is still called the Jolly Farmer. I think their incorporated name was Highview Church Farm. And George had, quote, collected the people by going up and down the eastern seaboard and preaching. And that way he would collect people and get them to come to this place in New Hampshire where he had bought 1,000 acres. And this was the farm. And this is where everyone was going to live and work. And what we were told was that we were waiting there for the end of days. And we were, quote, preparing for the end of days, wait for it, by building trimarans. And so the trimarans we were going to set to sea. Now we were a good hour from the ocean building these trimarans that were not at all seaworthy, but we spent a lot of time on them. And I think that that's a good thing if you are a cult leader. So just, Chris, in case you decide to start your own cult,
Right.
You want to keep your people busy doing something that isn't going to get them anywhere, but feels like it's going to take them to something magical. And so for many years, we worked on these boats because there was something about the idea of like sailing around the world that seemed very magical to everybody. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about where we would sail: Spain, France, Portugal. Although what we were building was not seaworthy. No one knew how to sail. I mean, we knew how to sail small boats, small crafts, but we didn't know how to sail a trimaran. And how hundreds of people were going to sail in these boats and live at sea and then do all this. No one ever planned that.
Right. Okay, got it. Yeah, we in Scientology, in the ex-Scientology world, tend to refer to the Scientology goals and sort of carrot and the stick thing as the hamster wheel of nowhere. You're just on this hamster wheel. You're just running, chasing this carrot, and you're never going to get it. It's so appealing and so fantastic that you never want to stop because it's so incredible if you could achieve it, right? This personal spiritual immortality and freedom,
right?
Which is often part of the reflected cult leaders' messaging is freedom and safety and security and community and all of these things. You mentioned hundreds of people. How big was this thing? How you had 1,000 acres up in New Hampshire? It's a farm plot. I mean, were there goats and chickens? Was it a real farm? What was this place like?
So the adults lived separately from the children, and the adults worked. They logged, and they worked they raised vegetables and so on. So we were fairly self-sustaining. We raised all our own vegetables. We had a large orchard. We had 1,000 sheep. We had originally cows, but then God told George that we were supposed to be drinking goat's milk. And so we got rid of the cows. So there's the sheep and there are the goats, ducks and 1,000 chickens. There's a lot of chickens. So we're a farming community. Um, we made sweaters and sold sweaters. A lot of these businesses didn't do as well as they should have. So you'd think with all that free labor that the businesses would have done pretty well. But under George's leadership, the businesses weren't as successful because George would always kind of do something odd, like he had them start a restaurant, but it wasn't open on Saturday because that's the Lord's Sabbath. I think he could have hired outside help to run it on Saturday, but he didn't, and so that turned out to be sort of a bad thing, not having the restaurant open on Saturday. He also spent a lot of money having this huge fountain behind the restaurant that was modeled after Bouchard Gardens in Victoria, Canada, which is where all the draft dodgers were sent. So there was a sort of outpost on Victoria, Canada, where the draft dodgers were sent. And so it was this like 30-foot colorful fountain with colored lights that played music from Handel. He was very fond of Handel. So the main music we were allowed to listen to at the farm was Handel's Messiah, Handel's Fireworks, water music. You get the idea.
Yeah.
And so, so again, like there would be these big ambitious projects like that might be expensive and difficult. But the main thing that makes a restaurant work is being open, 7 days a week, and that has to be open on the weekend, right? So you wouldn't do that. So all of the businesses were not necessarily successful, even though he had all this free labor and everything. And so apparently, after he died, the businesses did become successful in Canada, the quote Jolly Farmer businesses, because they started to run it on a much tighter basis. So I find that interesting that the Jolly Farmer was never successful till George Eversfield died.
That is interesting. Certainly indicates that wasn't either one, that wasn't his mainline goal, power and control was, or two, he just wasn't able to organize his way out of a wet paper bag. But yet he could get, all these people and animals and everything together and put an operation together. So clearly he could organize to some degree. So for whatever reason, it just somehow making that work just wasn't the most important part for him. Interesting though. How many children were there?
There's like 100 children. And we all lived in squads. We slept on the floor in sleeping bags. New Hampshire is cold, so it was cold. They had counselors kind of supervising us, and they didn't give us a whole lot of education. We would get up in the morning at 5, kind of go through our. It was they treated the children very much like we were all in the military all the time, like starting at age 4. You get up, you wash quickly, dress, march. Everybody's marching everywhere they go. You have a brief amount of schooling for 3 hours in the morning where you're sort of doing your reading, writing, and arithmetic, and then you start to work, and you work the rest of the day. Hauling wood, in the winter you're hauling wood, in the summer you're gardening or taking care of animals, but you're working all the time until you go to sleep. So all of us as children are working all of the time. Under the supervision of sort of older children. By the time kids are 13, they join the chainsaw crew because a lot of the money of the farm was from logging off this 1,000 acres and selling the firewood. I would say George Eversfield himself was extremely charismatic. Like the first time I saw a picture when I left the farm of Martin Sheen, I thought, oh my, that's George Eversfield, so sort of that kind of a look of a person. He was British. He had a British accent and everything. So he seemed godlike to everyone, and he just ruled the place with a sort of, rod of iron. He had a young woman who was maybe 30 or 40 years younger than him, 35 years younger than him, who had been his daughter's best friend when they'd been growing up. who lived with him as his sort of concubine. And anyone else who joined the farm who'd even been divorced was not allowed to stay at the farm. So if you had been divorced, you could not stay at the farm, even though, of course, George had been divorced and was now living with this young woman.
Right. Typical hypocrisy. Yeah.
Yeah. Eventually, he did marry her. But yeah, so he lived with this young woman, and the whole time that I was there, they just lived together as if they were man and wife.
But he was not a Keith Raniere or, sort of.
No, I mean, like even
lots of wives. This wasn't a polygamous situation.
No, he just had this one young woman.
One. Okay, got it. What were the dictates? Well, I'm actually first. I'm kind of curious because this is not easy to do. It's not easy to run around the country gathering up, 1,000 people with 100 kids to go to a farm and dedicate your life. What was the hook? I mean, he preached, but what was he preaching? Why were people? It was. I get the apocalyptic message, but what was the thing that made this so? Oh my God, this is the thing. Or what was it about his charisma or his messaging that got people?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've started that question with my own parents. My father did not end up joining, so my father and my parents got divorced over this. And my father met him. So my mother had been attending a church. She was attending university, and she felt kind of lost. I think she and my father were falling apart. She had, quote, had to get married. So I think they were probably barely holding on, as young couples might at that point. And she was feeling a little out of like her life wasn't going great. And I first of all think that a lot of the people that ended up joining, there was something going wrong in their life. And so when she met him, she felt her life wasn't going great. And the message that he preached was, there were 8 people on Noah's Ark. If you follow me, you will be one of those 8, because I am going to build Noah's Ark, and you are going to be one of those 8, because I see you as one of those 8. I see you completely as one of those 8. And so the original maybe 500 adults and with their kids who joined the farm felt seen, felt heard, felt understood by this person who was in touch with God. And I think everyone that joined, I mean, I think there's a large group of sort of worker people that you might say, if they hadn't joined the farm, might have been working at Walmart or something, or Kmart back then. In other words, we're sort of lost in their lives anyway. But there's always this other group that you have to ask yourself. And since you're familiar with cults, you have to ask yourself, but wait a minute. I mean, there was somebody who dropped out of Vassar. My mother's parents were teaching at Cornell when she decided to do this. She was going to St. John. My father went on to become a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. What was she doing? But in some way, she was disengaged from her life. Her life did not feel it was flowing forward smoothly. And this person saw her and told her that he could, as long as she kept following the path, she was going to heaven. So some part of her clicked into that,
Totally.
And I also think that once you and I'm sure people like this, once you drive to this place in New Hampshire, and then you've given this person your kids, your money, yourself. There were people that joined the farm and gave him their children, their money, everything they had, and after a few years left. There were definitely people that left in the early years. There was this one boy that I was very good friends with, and he was the only Black person there. And I mean, he and I were friends, and I really valued his friendship. And his parents got kicked out, and eventually his parents took him out and his sisters. Um, I haven't ever gotten the whole story, and it's funny because his sister just reached out to me recently, and I think I'm going to see her in May in DC, and so I'm going to try to find out from her. But my understanding of the story, in retrospect, is that her father clashed with George at some point, and that's why the dad had to leave. And I think that was the deal with certain people, because one of the things that George would do with couples to sort of control couples is he would be like, Chris, you and your wife are going to be living apart for the next couple months. And at the time, I remembered that happening as a child. And I remember thinking, why did they sort of seem unhappy? But now I realize, because I'm an adult, that like these people were in their 20s and 30s. They had very few happinesses in life, and one of them had to be that they get to be together at night.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether they had a love life or not, that would have been your own private time with your spouse.
Yeah.
And the only time that it's just the two of you in your little room. And people had very little private life. And so George is deliberately taking that away to show that he's the leader. And so this guy who was a surveyor and, one of the wealthiest people in the town, probably just didn't want to allow George to control him and his wife. And then he was gone. So I think there were people that left. But I also think that once you have told your family that you're in, that it would have been very hard to leave. So my mother's parents tried on a few occasions to get her back out. And I think it would have meant admitting she was wrong.
Right.
And as you know, since this is one of your areas of expertise, it's hard to admit that, because you have to say, I shouldn't have gone down this path.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. But first you have to recognize that you were wrong, and then you have to admit it. And just the recognition's hard enough, but I have said many, many times that literally the three hardest words to say anywhere in any language, I don't care who you are, is I don't know. Mm-hmm. Or I was wrong. You flip a coin. I don't know which one is harder, because they both seem to be damn near impossible for so many people to say. Also, it's worth commenting that the point you made about how people got in is important, because it's not a matter of their intelligence or their social standing or status. It has to do with their emotional needs. It has to do with where they're at. And as you pointed out, unprompted, a bunch of these people had something wrong in their life. They were experiencing some tumult, some upset, some uncertainty. They were on shaky ground, and that's exactly where people are most ripe for cult recruitment.
Right.
And they don't have the answers, and they need them.
Right. I mean, since then, I've just had so many people, talk with me about this and make this assumption that everybody is sort of, double-digit IQ.
Right.
And, I remember the adults there, and certainly there might have been some adults that weren't thinking as clearly as they could have been. But I remember a number of very intelligent people who had made this decision because they had a need to believe, because they were emotionally shaky, and George found that weakness.
Okay.
So one thing I'm kind of curious. I mean, Scientology is much more everywhere than where I grew up, but one of the things in terms of recovery is, I moved 3,000 miles away, and of other people that I know who did leave, who didn't move away, there hasn't been, for some people, there hasn't been a recovery at all. They're kind of right where they were when they left. I mean, I have one friend who left there who hasn't been able to work or have a relationship, or, her life hasn't really moved along. And I think that for most people that I know who have left there, it's been very hard to have a life. And that's partly because one of the problems with being in a cult is you lose the ability for executive functioning. And I think that the cult leader takes over executive functioning. And so during the time that you're there, you don't have to do that. You don't have to make decisions. And really, what makes us leaders in our life or in our world is executive functioning. So you're running a podcast, so I'm going to assume that you've got some executive functioning, right? But if you because it takes some executive functioning just to set something up, to set up a business, of some kind. But by the time you've left a cult, whatever capacity for executive functioning you have is pretty much flattened along with your ego. And because you have no real sense of like who you are, the capacity to say, like, when I left there at 18, if you had said, like, who are you? I would have said, I'm nobody. When I filled out a job application, who to contact in case of emergency, I would write nobody. The first time I was filling out a job application, I got to that part where it said sex, and I didn't know what to write. I thought maybe people have had sex before they get their first job, and I thought, good for them. And then I wrote in, not yet, but soon, hopefully. And then I did get the job. So I thought, that's good. They believe me. I'm going to get out there and have some sex. But my feeling was that I just like barely actually existed. Like that I barely actually existed on the planet. And it was like, even decades later now, there'll still be times when something will happen and I'll have that moment of erasure that will still sort of, drift across me. And I feel like that thing that allows people who don't grow up in cults to feel like, I got this, I'm cool, is something that you have to build up inside yourself. And I do think that moving geographically or physically away from whatever center pulled you in kind of helps. I mean, there are Scientology centers all over the place, so it seems like it would be harder, in your case. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I think that's an interesting point of view. Because I've not related it to geography that way, particularly in terms of recovery, but I definitely appreciate your point. I think that the way that I've thought about what you're talking about there in terms of that empty feeling, that lack of self, that feeling like I'm not here, there's nothing here without the group or the cult leader, is what I've just termed the codependency of the relationship. That the cult leader needs you, but you need the cult leader. It's a two-way street in those relationships, and that's part of the power of the relationship. And it's like that with all the membership, right? They all feel this way. And another aspect of this from that some psychologists have put forward is the idea that the cult members, part of that codependency is actually adopting the personality traits of the cult leader, that they actually become their idea of who this person is. They take that on as their personality, or they try to, in order to give themselves meaning and purpose in life, is, well, here's my model to follow, so I'm going to be just like this guy or this woman. And that's how I'm going to model my life. And once that's gone, if there's an escape or a departure or a blow up or oh my God, this isn't what I thought it was, and then they leave, there's just this big void. Because the self has been so defined by this other person's self, and once that's gone, you're like, well, wait a minute, who am I really? What is this all about? You left when you were 18, is that right? And you left with a dog on a string? Did I?
Yeah.
So, right?
Yeah. So I left.
What happened? What was your escape? How'd you like okay, I got to get out of this?
Yeah, so I mean, there was actually kind of an incident that happened, and George kind of called me in and said that I had done something wrong, and that I was quote being kicked out, and it was basically like something that had happened a number of times in my life there, and it was sort of a note on which I was supposed to apologize, and my mother was there. And I didn't see her very often, but she was there. So it was obviously kind of a big deal that I was supposed to apologize and everything. And I thought, uh, I've just turned 18. This is it. I can just go. And I said, I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave. And there's this whole sort of conversation that ensued. George was like, you're never going to make it, and you're going to go to hell. You're never going to make it. You're dead to us when you leave. You'll never see anyone here again.
Yeah.
And I had just like I'd always had this image in my head, or I had at that point for a long time, of myself walking down that road, and I could just see myself walking down that road. And if you turned left at the end of that road, you had like 30, 40 miles and you would get to Concord. If you turned right 10 miles later, you'd be at Newport, New Hampshire, which is a small town. And, I didn't know which way I would go, but I knew I was going to be walking down that road. And so I just was like, I'm leaving. And, my mother followed me when I went to pack, which didn't take long. I had this little green bag and I threw in, my harmonica, my sleeping bag. And she was like, I'm going to give you some money. You're going to need money. And so she handed me $2. And I remember thinking, wow, I wonder how far this takes me. Like, what will I do with this? I didn't have a wallet, so I just stuck it into the green bag.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm going to totally interrupt you for a second here because I got to walk back for a second because I want to get the full context of what you're telling me. Are you saying that you had not really been off this farm in your life?
No, I mean, like I hadn't been anywhere. Like I hadn't spent any money.
Wow.
Yeah, I had no idea
so
what.
You knew that there were places outside the farm, but you didn't go there.
Right.
Okay. Right. And your experience of the world, no TV, no radio, no movies.
Right.
So whatever education you had in reading, writing, whatever, that was it as far as outside world exposure?
Right. I had read very few books besides the Bible.
My goodness. So this is full on Truman Show.
So she gives me the $2. I have no idea what $2 will do for me.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, I throw the $2 into the bag. She hands me my birth certificate, which I lost in the woods a few days later. And ended up having to get it replaced. I mean, I didn't realize it was important.
Yeah.
So I must have just left it behind when I was sleeping in the woods. Because just didn't seem, it was just a piece of paper.
Right.
And I didn't have a driver's license. I didn't have a social security number. So like, I don't know how I thought I was going to get a job anyway. So off I went. And
wow. I mean, there's bravery there, right? People have commented on this, right? I mean, this is a gutsy move.
Yeah.
Wow. Good for you.
Yeah. So it's funny. I remember like, as I was walking away, hearing the sheep, kind of bang and thinking it's almost feeding time and thinking, it's also almost dinner time, like going away from dinner, and oddly, just jumping forward that winter. So I kind of hung around that town. I really didn't walk to Newport, did odd jobs around the town. But that winter, I was hanging around the library reading books, and a woman that I met at the library hired me to take care of her kid. So I ended up being sort of a live-in babysitter. And like a lot of New Hampshire houses, her house, the attic was sort of insulated with magazines. And so I was living in the attic, which was insulated with magazines. And this is, when I finally saved up enough money to get out of New Hampshire that winter. But um, the magazines that it was insulated with were mostly Playboy, which I had never heard of.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so I did a deep dive that winter, and it was quite an interesting sort of education for me at 18,
What, what,
into the
what?
dark side.
Yeah, I get that. May I ask what year this was?
So this would have been the winter of 1981.
81. Okay, got it. All right. So well before the internet comes along. We're
Yeah,
not quite there yet, but
yeah,
you were getting a deep dive into the real world now.
right.
That must have been a
Centerfold.
wild year, your first year out.
Yeah, so it's just like, I mean, like, there's just so much that I didn't know. Obviously, so many words about sex that I'd never heard of.
Hmm.
And so words, it was an interesting kind of thing because obviously words that everyone else knew about sex that I had never heard of.
Right.
I was kind of figuring out. Um,
You had at least been given basic sex ed in terms of birds and bees.
well, okay, no, but I lived on a farm. So, I
Oh,
mean, we lived
sure.
on a farm. So,
You kind of can't avoid it. It's right there,
yeah,
especially with that many animals.
right, right, right,
Okay. Okay.
right.
Okay.
So interestingly, in my job now as an editor, oddly, I think so we have published a couple books that had to do with cults. One about the Warren Jeffs cult. I'm assuming
Mhm.
you've heard of that
Oh, yeah.
cult.
Yeah.
Called Strange Children, a wonderful book. And I do find that I feel like actually Red Hen gets a disproportionate number of cult books sent to it. I don't know if the word is out that Kate's interested in cults. The book Under Neon Sun that is coming out right now is not really about cults, but touches on cults. So the girl that's in it, who is an unhoused person, was formerly in a cult, and I think that was partly because of my cult background. I weaved that in there, and it was kind of interesting to do, but also because I thought, when you think about how people become unhoused, how like there's thousands of teenagers who are attending community colleges in California, and you think about how they got there. Some of them it's because they're part of the LGBT community, and so their parents didn't continue to take care of them. But also, I think that once you have left a cult, and this is what we were talking about earlier, your ways of quote making it in the world become very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that often you're not connected with your relatives. Um, you don't really have job skills. I did not have a long list of job skills. I knew how to take care of kids. I knew how to garden. I knew how to paint a barn. And let me say, that's an odd list of skills to put down on a resume, which I didn't know how to write. Um, and so I felt like if I was going to have an unhoused white girl in the San Fernando Valley, how did she get that way? I mean, in my case, she was queer, but if her parents hadn't turned her out for being queer, having her, having run away from a cult was as good a way as any of her ending up that way. Because I really think that at the point someone decides to get out of a cult, that's part of the reason that it's hard to, because you do not know how you're going to make it in the real world. Um, you feel like, is anybody going to take care of me? Is anybody going to help me? How am I going to function? And again, what we just talked about before, you don't feel like you have any real sense of self, of who you're going to be out there, because your sense of self has been so much defined by being crushed by this leader person. Interestingly, Jim Jones happened while I was at the cult, and that really had quite an effect on the cult. There was a lot of conversation about it, because we had talked about, or George had talked with us about our moving to Paraguay. And
Oh, really?
so there'd been a lot of conversation about her moving to Paraguay. And then when the Jim Jones thing happened, I think the conversation about Paraguay kind of continued, but there seemed to be some concern that there would be an investigation, and because actually the farm was being investigated quite a bit by that time by the state of New Hampshire,
Mm.
because of allegations of repeated child abuse. And the child abuse was much more physical abuse. Kids would leave and complain that they were beating kids a lot, which they were. And so when the
Kids would
Jim
kind of
Jones,
run off the property and tell other people, and then the cops would come and check it out, sort of thing.
the child services would come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So child services were visiting enough that I think it was starting to become problematic. And so when Jim Jones happened, there was just a lot of conversation about whether we would be seen as that kind of an organization. And, I just remember so clearly thinking as a kid, but we are that organization. If George, yeah, we are Jim Jones. If George tells most of these people to drink the Kool-Aid, they're all drinking the Kool-Aid. What are we talking about? We're Jim Jones right now. And because I just thought if all these people are willing to give their kids to George to be beaten, then it's just a short step to drinking the Kool-Aid, you know? And so I think that's the whole thing with a cult. If you're willing to give your kids and, send them down to, what is the place down in Florida that the Scientology kids
Oh,
get sent?
Clearwater. Yeah, down in Clearwater. Yeah.
Yeah, to Clearwater, or, if you're willing to send your kids away, um, then what is the next step? How is Kool-Aid so difficult? You know,
Yeah.
um, and when Waco happened, I remember thinking a lot about that too, because basically the things that cults can be closed down for it's obviously not when Shelley Miscavige disappears. It's stockpiling weapons, because I keep wondering where she is, by the way.
Oh,
Um,
we do know where she is. I'll tell you after.
Oh, okay. So I do want to know.
Yeah.
But it seems to be that the only reason to investigate cults is um, when you know that children are being abused, and that seems to be hard to nail down.
Yep.
And when you're stockpiling weapons, which is what happened at Waco, of course. But like in the case of the farm, when they did investigate, and the state of New Hampshire investigated many, many times, but when they did, we were trained to say, I'm happy, healthy, and helpful.
Right.
And so, on what basis, they never got us alone without the adults, and, that we just always said the same thing. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know why that didn't seem odd to them that all the kids said the same thing.
Oh, it did. It did. It's just that their hands were tied.
Yeah.
I'm being charitable. Maybe they were idiots, but generally speaking, when there's a complaint, but then you go investigate and everybody's telling you it's all good. This is not dissimilar to how cult leaders routinely escape justice. Is one person will get away. David Miscavige did this. Few people got away. He beats on the staff on a routine basis. I was beaten up. He was beaten up. She was beaten up. This happened. And then here come 20 affidavits signed by the rest of his inner circle who are still in, saying that never happened. It will never happen. He's never like that. These people are delusional. And there it is. That ends the investigation, because without evidence or somebody, there stepping up, it becomes he said, she said, which is very, very, very hard to pursue or prosecute.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'm not saying I agree with all this. I'm just saying
Right.
This is what we run into,
Right.
in trying to do this, is they do the runaround, and this is the problem with with trying to enforce the law when you're when you're dealing with a cult.
Right.
Everybody will just say exactly what the cult leader wants, and there's no legal recognition of the concept of coercive control in that situation. We're just barely starting to get there with domestic violence.
Right.
right? That's where coercive control is a legally recognized concept for women, battered men, domestic situations. But you try to bring that out to a cult situation or a gang situation, we're not there yet, is
Right.
basically the problem.
I don't know if you have had this situation with yourself either, but one of the other things that people would often ask me about is why I didn't or still don't go back for other people. So, my mother died there, my sister is still there, and she has 5 children. And obviously for a long time I was young and going to college and that kind of thing. But the thing about it is that it's kind of like saying, once you get to AA, why don't you go back for all your buddies? You know what I mean? Your buddies would have to want to get out themselves. And
Right.
so the thing about it is that, first of all, they know you got out. If you went into AA, your buddies know you're in AA now, and they see you now having a job, driving a car, keeping the same girlfriend for more than 2 days. So they could aspire to that, um, my sister, was very smart and played several instruments and certainly could have made different choices herself also. So I think that the idea that you can just go and pull people out of situations is really not true.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard to do. There are professional people who do that work. It's called occult intervention. It happens.
Right.
It gets done. It gets arranged. But it's not anything like, and I want to stress, it's not anything like, the shit that used to go down in the 80s and 90s where they kidnap people and that whole deprogramming crap. That's all ancient history. Nobody's doing that crap anymore. It looks more like an arranged conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can either talk to the person and deal with them and get them to see things, or you can't.
Right.
And at the end of the day, people have the choices to make their own choices for their own life, and you can do your best to try to intervene and try to introduce new ideas and concepts to the person, and hopefully set it up in such a way that they'll be willing to listen. Otherwise, the whole thing is a waste of time.
Right.
If you can arrange that, you have a chance. And it's been done. I've been part of such things. It can be done, but it's a challenge, and there's no guarantee of any success at all.
Right. Yeah.
So I would never expect you to just go back. I mean, knowing all the things I know about this, I would never look at you. In fact, it was so interesting when you said it, because I went, wow, nobody's ever asked me anything like that with Scientology. Like, I'm going to go back down to the base and go, hey guys, that doesn't work that way at all.
Well, yeah, it seemed to me that, a number of people were like, wouldn't you want to? And my feeling was always no. I first of all, I never want to go back there again.
That's right.
I mean, during COVID, at some point when I realized that my mother was dying, I would have liked, of course, to go and say goodbye to her, no doubt. Right. But because of COVID, if I went there, I would have been kind of stuck there for 2 weeks. So I just talked with her on the phone because I was not going to go and be stuck there for 2 weeks.
Right.
Even now, I'm not going to go and be stuck for 2 weeks.
Right. Very understandable, especially there.
Yeah, exactly. I could imagine visiting if I had, my kids with me or my husband with me, but I really can't even imagine going in for a visit by myself. I just, want to be, in a safe zone myself,
Absolutely. The first time I should say that I went back to LA to the Blue Buildings where I worked for 17 years and lived and worked. Those blue buildings were my entire world, just like that farm was yours. Mm-hmm. First time I went back there after I left, my stomach was doing more flippy floppies than I've ever experienced in my entire life. I couldn't believe I was breaking out in sweat. I was having, anxiety, panic attacks. It was I tried to downplay it, and I didn't even want to really admit it to myself at the time that it was happening, but it was real. It was very, very, I was shaking.
Yeah.
And that was a place where I was, physically and psychologically tormented for many, many years. It's completely understandable. It is in no way, shape, or form your responsibility to go back and get anybody out. That's not on you.
Right.
No, you got yourself out, and that's in terms of responsibility, that's the only one you really have to yourself. After that, it's you can make your own choices about that, but it's not your burden to carry. I hope nobody's been trying to push that off on you.
Yeah, it's funny that that blue building on Sunset
Yeah.
is right. It's right across from Kaiser Sunset.
Yeah.
So I'm generally just freaked out by cults in general, and so my husband had open heart surgery, and the whole time that I was waiting for him, I was looking down on that blue building,
Oh,
and it was,
really?
yeah, you're just looking right at that, and it just was so freaky to me to feel like I'm looking at this, and I'm just like waiting to see if this everything's going to be okay over this several hour thing, and it I don't know, it just felt like this very unreal moment. So I'll tell you one other thing that
Yeah.
always comes back to me. Um, so maybe a year or so after I had left the farm, as I said, I had worked for this one woman, saved up money, and then I took a bus to Virginia. And I just knew one ex-farm person who was there who had said, like, maybe you'd like Virginia. I just wanted to get out of New Hampshire at that point. And so I ended up there, and I was like babysitting and so on, and dating this guy who had left the farm also.
No.
And we were both very Christian still at this point. You have to imagine, like, we haven't strayed very far from our little Christianity. And I'm trying to be a different person, but like in my head, I'm not as different as I would like to think.
Mm-hmm.
So he tells me that we're going to get married, and that God told him that we're going to get married, and that God told him that we should not go to college, that I should not go to college. And I'm like, oh, I talk to God all the time. He never mentioned me getting married to you, and he never mentioned anything about college. And so we broke up, and I immediately felt that I ought to start college, although I had no idea what people even did in college. Like I didn't know anything about college. Like, what do people even do? So every day when I went to my babysitting job, I drove by this college, and there was a sign out front that said J. Sargent Reynolds Community College. So I went by the next day and I said, sign me up. I'm attending college. And I go to the administration building, and they're like, okay, we're going to send you to a counselor. So the counselor sits me down and said, we're going to have you take a placement test. Well, they first of all said, do you have a high school diploma? And I'm like, no. Okay, we're going to have you take a placement test. They do all the placement tests. And then she sits me down. She's like, okay, so you scored very well on the placement test. So we can put you in, freshman English, freshman math, blah, blah, blah. What is your major going to be? And I was like, what do I need a major for? And she's like, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I was like, oh, how long is that going to take? And she's like, 4 years. And I was like, 4 years? What if the rapture happens first? And then she's like, if the rapture happens, she's this lovely African American woman, she's like, the rapture happens, you'll be partway through college. And then she says, wait a minute, did you know this is a Black college? And I was like, oh, that's great. Am I allowed to go here? And she's like, yeah, you can. I just want to know if you knew that. I was like, yeah, it's great. So she said, so again, what do you think you're going to do 4 years from now? I said, well, let me think. Right now I'm babysitting, so I should probably do something different. I'm going to pick fruit. Okay. So what are you going to study here? And I said, Spanish. I'm going to need Spanish for my fruit picking. Okay. Well, the Spanish department here is not very big, but sure. Okay. Spanish it is. Put you down for a Spanish major. So I enroll as a Spanish major. I start taking Spanish classes at the community college. And after a year, I got to be friends with one of my employers who suggests I move to Arizona. She's like, you could be a Spanish major out in Arizona. There's lots of people out there that speak Spanish. Okay, great. So I pack everything in my car, and in 3 days, I drive to Arizona, sleeping at rest stops along the way. And I enroll in Arizona State. And that's where I meet Rita Dove, who later became the Poet Laureate of the US and all that.
Ah,
And I tell Rita Dove, hey, I'm taking some poetry classes and like that. And she says to me, what's your major? Now, at this point, I'm probably like 2.5 years or so, maybe out of the cult. And I'm open my mouth to tell the future Poet Laureate, I'm a Spanish major. I'm going to be a fruit picker, but I'm just smart enough to realize that sounds foolish. So I say, I'm thinking of becoming an English major. And she says, that's a good idea. And then I became an English major, graduated as an English major, and went to graduate school because I had so few job skills that, why not go to graduate school so you can develop some more job skills along the way. And so by the
you just
time,
get student loans along the way for all of this?
yeah, I mean, I actually at Arizona State University, because I'd never lived with either of my parents, I registered as an orphan. And so I was able to get a lot of grants. So I graduated from Arizona State with only 14,000 in student loans.
Wow, well done.
Yeah,
Good
yeah.
job.
So I did take out student loans for my PhD program. But if you ask yourself if you're more influenced by your environment or your genes, since my mother's parents both taught at Cornell and my father taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and I wandered off a cult with no education and found myself a PhD and started a publishing company in Los Angeles, I think I'm one for the genes.
I think there might be some influence there. Yeah, nature and nurture and all that.
But I have to say that I do think that if anyone who's listening to this knows anybody that's left a cult, that as much energy as you can put into telling this person that they are going to be okay, and that the way they feel right now is not the way they're going to feel in 3 years or 5 years once they start doing things for themselves. Because the thing at the cult is you're led to believe that you can't be anything or do anything. And the funny thing is that after you leave, if your life moves forward and you do things and you succeed, when I was 40 that year, I finished my PhD, I climbed Mount Whitney, I ran my first marathon. And it was like I started to say to myself, I'm not a loser anymore. I probably never was one, but of course, when you're at a cult, you're there because you're a loser. You walked in the door because you're a loser, and this leader person is going to drag you along like you're a wet cat. And when you walk out the door, though, you haven't left that wet cat behind. You still feel like that person. And so it's acting on the world and having people see you that allows you to be able to see yourself differently. And so, if you're the person that is with this person and you can see them and say, like, hey, Chris, I see you. Look at you, dude. You've been away from Scientology. You've started a podcast. You're giving other people faith in the world. You're rocking it. I think that, and if you are that person that's left a cult, just like keep putting one foot in front of the other is what I would say, because I do think it helps to get away. I think you would agree with that, Chris. It helps to get as far away as possible.
Oh, yeah.
And make a different set of friends,
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask you about that specifically, in fact, in terms of support network, because that's one of the most crucial things in successfully getting out and not falling into another cult is setting up a good support system. If you set up another support system that's just another cult, leads you down the path, to another situation, well, that's not so good. So that would be a bad support system, right? So you want a good one. You found a husband, you found friends, you kind of teachers, people who were advising you. How did you, was this just sort of a fully organic thing? Did you realize you needed some connections that could help you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've been as successful as I maybe could have or should have been, but I mean, I always feel like I do feel like having grown up in a cult that developing friendships is still like I wouldn't say it's challenging, but I would just say that it's something I still give a lot of thought to because I feel like that when you are in that situation, you um, you don't learn to trust other people
Mm-hmm.
because the people around you in that organization are not trustworthy, and so trusting yourself and your relationships with other people is challenging. And so I would say that I ended up with a small but fantastic group of people who were other creative, edgy, cool people. Um, but a number of the people I left who left about the same time as I did ended up joining the military because I think the military, which is another cult, felt very safe to them because it's somebody else to tell them what to do and someone else to form that executive functioning role for them. And it is very cult like. And so it was very interesting to me how many of the people that left the farm ended up joining up. Um, Uncle Sam would be their next leader
Sure.
person. Um,
I could see why that would have appeal. I mean, there's certainly rigidity, structure, rules, 3 squares a day, purpose, meaning. I mean, there's a lot that the military offers to people who are otherwise adrift or lacking that. And coming out of a cult would certainly be somebody fit in that bill. I don't know that I would recommend it particularly,
Yeah, I
but
mean, wouldn't have been my thing, but
yeah,
again, and I'm not even saying that being in the military is a bad thing. I think that for some people it helps them straighten out their lives.
that's right.
But
It
but
does.
I definitely think that for an ex-cult person, there's a level of attraction to that.
Absolutely. It's a sort of a faux cult hopping there because it's not exactly the same thing as a full on destructive situation with some charismatic leader, at his whim, sexually or financially or otherwise abusing people. It's a very different situation in the military, but the degree of control is very similar. And that's, I think, where people see the parallels in that. But you have so much more free will in a military situation than you would ever have in the Sea organization or
Right,
on that farm situation you were on, where it's really your life is really not your own
right. I
and
mean,
choices are
again,
not yours. Yeah,
I, I I recommend to people obviously your book and Amanda Montell's book Cultish, where she really tries to kind of draw the line between what is a cult and what is cultish. Like she says, really, when you get down to it, you know, Soul Cycle is cultish, right? It's cultish in the way that like people in the little in Soul Cycle think they're better than people that aren't. You know, people that shop at Whole Foods can be cultish, and so in that way, the military can be cultish. But in all three of those cases that I just mentioned, there's an exit strategy. You could just stop going to Soul Cycle. You could stop shopping at Whole Foods, and after your 4 years, you could stop being in the military.
yeah.
So if there's an exit strategy, it might be cultish, but it isn't a cult in the way that we're talking about, where the exit strategy gets to be very challenging.
Well, exactly. As they say, another way we've put that is, you know, um, well, that you can one of the best ways you can tell whether a group would fit under this idea of a destructive cult is what happens when you try to leave.
Right. Exactly.
What's the
Exactly.
process, right? What occurs?
Right.
And if it results in you being, disconnected, shunned, hated, reviled, etc., then there's some extremism going on there, to say the least.
Right. Exactly.
And that's what we're looking for, right? Is extremist ideas. It's not a matter of having commitment or faith or a strong belief in a thing. It's being so committed to it emotionally that you lose your ability to think about anything else as real or true.
Right.
And that's a level of commitment that is dangerous, no matter who you are, no matter what it is you're committing to, whether it's an individual, a belief, a dogma, a flag, whatever, a sports team. I don't, it doesn't matter. You should never be all in on
Right.
anything.
Right.
that's that's at least psychologically, that's the point where I think we start losing the plot. We lose our ability to think critically.
Right.
How interesting this. Yeah. So now you've really made something of your life, which is awesome. So I'm curious. if you would have advice for, other than, you know, what we've covered, would you have any other advice for people in terms of, you know, escaping, structuring your life, and moving on from that? In any of those phases or any of those bits of this, do you have anything else you'd like to offer for people out there from your own experience?
Well, you know, my thought about getting out is at the point that you have decided that you want to leave whatever structured cult situation you're in, or even a destructive group or family that you're in. I definitely am all about getting out as soon as you can. But at the point that you are trying to figure out your life after that, um, I really, what I tried to move toward and what I still think about every day, uh, is the idea of finding joy. And I think that finding joy is different for other people. Different for each person. I have friends that knit every day. I really admire the knitters of the world. I am not a person that knits. Um, when I have time to just like sit down and my husband wants to watch a television show, I'm sad to say that I have a laptop in my lap and my hands are running over the keys and I'm, answering emails or something like that. But I love that. I love the idea that some of my friends knit. That's them finding joy. And I swim. I gave up running marathons at some point, and I swim, and I find a great deal of joy in swimming. And so I think that like for each of us, like we need to have something that we're doing every day, every week that gives us a great deal of joy. And I think that was one of the things that a lot of people kind of climbed back to during the pandemic when people were baking and doing different things like this. They were kind of coming back to things that gave them joy. So I have quite a bit of I like walking and swimming and that kind of thing that gives me joy. And and then, obviously writing and reading give me joy. Being with my family gives me joy. But I very much think about that because I feel like the first 15 years of my life, there was a lot of the joy was crushed out of it. And so now I want to lean into that. And I want to remember that the what we're doing here, as far as I know, we only get one time around. And so I want to lean into joy and gratitude for every bit of time that I have, every time that I get to spend with somebody. Very grateful, Chris, for this time with you. I feel like all of us who have gotten out, that it's a privilege to have gotten out. And that's the other thing is that like, whenever I'm talking with someone and they're talking about how my early life was so hard and I didn't get to have a childhood and I didn't get to have parents, I always think, but I got to get out. I got out. A lot of other people just didn't get out, and some of the people that got out didn't get anywhere with their life. They just stopped. Their life stopped there.
Yeah.
And I got to have, I didn't make a lot of money. You can see though I've got a lot of books. So I live in a world of stories, and I got to go to Paris, and I got to have a life, and so that's what I always think. I'm so grateful that I got out and that I got to walk around the world, and then I got to experience joy. And I was married twice. I am married now, so I've been married twice, and I still love my first husband so much, and I love my second husband so much. My first husband is at my house for all the holidays because he's such a delightful person, and he's the father of my children, such a delightful guy. And so, like, I just find a way to love and to live in joy.
That is just the most awesome answer anybody's given me. That's just great. I Beautiful. Thank you for that. I feel so similar. For so long after leaving Scientology, it was all about the work and getting work done and being productive and work, 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 work. And if I'm not providing value to the world or education to the world, then somehow I am not valuable myself. I do not have value unless I am helping other people. And that was a theme that ran through my entire life. And it was only in the last couple of years that it became, I had to start practicing doing nothing, just sitting on the couch, doing nothing. I had to practice it because it was so painful to do, right? Because it felt so wrong. I was so morally driven to have to be saving the world all the time, and it just took forever to break free of the idea that saving the world is something valuable and important and something to hold on to as a goal is ridiculous. The world doesn't need saving, and I'm certainly not going to be the one to do it if it does. So maybe instead, enjoying every day of our life is actually kind of important instead, because maybe that's what it's all about. Is if you're not enjoying it, what are you doing it for? And that shift, I think, is my version of everything you just said there in terms of finding joy. Otherwise, what's the point, of all this? Because I'm kind of a one-time around person too, and it used to be very different. I was also in a situation where, no, we've got lots of times around, and this is just one of millions, and I'm coming back, and losing that was a little hard. That was a tough one. But anyway, just relating with what you're saying here. I want to thank you very much for being part of this. I want to ask, how do people reach you, reach out to you, contact you, follow your work? Where do they go?
So on my website, there's a list of all the events I'm going to be doing for Under a Neon Sun. So I'm doing events around the country. You could also follow me on...
What's the name of the website?
www.kategale.com.
KateGale.com.
Yep, kategale.com. And then you could follow me on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Kate Gale. And I'll be posting my events on there too. So love to see you at one of these events.
Absolutely. Well, I'll try to get out to LA and see if I can. It's been a while since I've been to California, but born and raised, I should get back out there.
So where are you, Chris?
I'm in Denver.
Okay, yeah. I haven't made any plans to come to Tattered Cover yet, but if I do, I'll let you know.
Oh, you know about Tattered Cover out here? Yeah, it'd be awesome if you came out. Definitely let me know.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, folks out there, I definitely recommend you check out her work and her website. It's very interesting stuff. And especially if you're into poetry, which she writes a lot of. And so I hope you guys will check that out. I know writing is... Let me ask you one last question, actually. Have you found or used your writing for catharsis?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've worked out a lot through poetry, particularly.
Yeah, I bet. I didn't want to assume, but I figured that was the case. All right. Well, again, thank you very much for taking the time today and sharing your story with me and my audience. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. All right, folks out there, check out Kate Gale's site. And of course, if you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications button, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks for coming around and watching, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.